Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter. The sentence dropped into the quiet bank lobby like a stone in still water. Conversation stopped. Keyboard slowed. A few people turned their heads, curious, the way strangers always do when tension slips into an ordinary morning. Margaret Johnson stood at the polished marble counter, her small frame wrapped in a faded brown coat that had seen too many winters. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the counter, thin fingers curled around a worn leather purse. She didn't move right away. She simply blinked, as if trying to understand how a simple visit to the bank had suddenly become something else entirely. The young teller behind the glass window avoided her eyes and glanced toward the man standing a few feet away. Richard Collins, the branch manager, adjusted the cuff of his expensive navy suit and let out a quiet sigh that carried across the counter. His posture suggested impatience more than concern, as if Margaret had interrupted something important simply by standing there. Around them, the bank stretched wide and bright under rows of soft white ceiling lights. The smell of polished wood and fresh printer paper hung in the air. A digital screen near the wall blinked numbers for the next customer in line, but no one stepped forward. The moment had frozen the room. Margaret slowly slid a folded document across the counter. The paper trembled slightly in her hand, though her voice remained calm when she spoke. "I'm just here to withdraw some money from my account, sir." Collins glanced at the paper, then at Margaret, his expression tightening in quiet skepticism. "Ma'am, we've already explained that there's an issue with the documentation you brought." Margaret frowned gently, confusion replacing the patience she had carried into the building. "But I've had this account here for 30 years, she said softly. Her voice carried the calm tone of someone used to speaking politely, even when the world around her felt uncertain. Collins gave a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That may be, but we still have to verify things properly." A faint murmur rippled through the line behind her. Someone shifted their weight. Another person glanced at their phone, pretending not to watch. Margaret remained where she was, shoulders slightly hunched, but her chin lifted with quiet dignity. She reached into her purse again, pulling out another envelope carefully folded at the corners. The edges were worn from years of handling. "This letter should confirm everything," she said. Collins barely looked at it before pushing it back across the counter with 2 fingers. "Ma'am, I think it would be best if you came back another day." The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning behind them landed heavy in the silence. Margaret's eyes lowered to the counter for a moment. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished marble surface. When she looked up again, the calm in her voice had not changed. "I can't come back another day," she said quietly. "My grandson has surgery this afternoon." The room seemed to tighten around the sentence. A few people exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Collins inhaled slowly as if deciding something. Then he gestured lightly toward the security desk near the entrance. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firmer now, "if you can't provide proper verification today, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside so we can assist other customers." Margaret's hands remained resting on the counter. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, the quiet weight of her dignity filling the space where anger might have been. Behind her, near the end of the line, a tall man in a dark jacket had been watching the entire exchange without saying a word. His baseball cap was pulled low, shadowing most of his face. But as Margaret slowly gathered her papers from the counter, the man lifted his head slightly, his eyes settling on the manager with a calm, steady focus that suggested the moment was far from over. Margaret Johnson carefully gathered the papers that had been pushed back toward her, smoothing the edges with slow, deliberate movements, as though the thin sheets of paper deserved more respect than the moment they had just witnessed. Her hands still trembled slightly, but she kept them steady by pressing the documents gently against the marble counter before sliding them back into the worn envelope. The lobby remained unusually quiet. People in line shifted their weight and exchanged brief glances, unsure whether to look away or keep watching. Margaret had lived 72 years learning how rooms could change when people decided you did not belong in them. The feeling was familiar, but that did not make it easier. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder and took a slow breath. In her mind, she pictured the small hospital room across town where her grandson, Daniel, was waiting with his mother. The boy had been brave that morning when the nurse explained the procedure. 10 years old and already trying to act strong for everyone else. Margaret had promised him she would be back before the doctors wheeled him into surgery. That promise sat in her chest, now heavier than anything that had just happened at the bank counter. Richard Collins tapped the edge of the counter with a pen, clearly ready to move on to the next customer. "Next in line," he called out, his voice returning to its professional tone as though the uncomfortable moment had already passed. But Margaret did not move right away. She checked the envelope once more, making sure every document was inside. Account statements, identification, and a letter she had brought from the bank itself confirming the account number she had used for decades. Her late husband, Samuel Johnson, had opened that account 34 years earlier when they moved into their modest brick home on the east side of town. Samuel had believed in doing things the proper way. Save a little every month. Pay every bill on time. Respect the institutions that serve the community. Margaret had followed that same philosophy long after he passed away. She glanced once more at the counter before turning away, preparing to step aside just as the manager had asked. But the quiet presence behind her had not disappeared. The tall man at the end of the line had moved slightly closer now, though he still said nothing. From where Margaret stood, she could feel the subtle shift in the room. The man's posture was relaxed, but his attention was unmistakably fixed on the exchange that had just taken place. His jacket was simple black leather, the kind that looked well worn but expensive at the same time. The brim of his dark baseball cap still shaded most of his face. Margaret noticed him only briefly as she stepped away from the counter. She gave him the same polite nod she would give any stranger sharing the same space. The man returned the nod with quiet respect, his eyes following the envelope in her hands for a moment before lifting toward the bank manager again. Collins had already turned his attention to the next customer, a young man in a gray sweater who approached the counter quickly, eager to move past the awkward interruption. The lobby noise slowly began to return. Keyboards clicked again. A printer hummed somewhere behind the counter. The digital display near the wall advanced to the next number. Margaret walked a few steps toward the row of chairs along the wall where customers waited during longer transactions. She lowered herself carefully into the nearest seat, placing her purse and envelope on her lap. Her eyes moved toward the large windows facing the street where late morning sunlight reflected off passing cars. For a moment she closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, asking for patience and a little bit of grace in a morning that had started to feel much longer than it should have been. Across the lobby, the tall man finally stepped forward in line. But instead of looking down at his phone like the others had done earlier, he kept watching the manager behind the counter with a calm expression that suggested he had not finished paying attention to what had just happened. The quiet rhythm of the bank lobby continued to rebuild itself piece by piece, but the atmosphere had not fully returned to normal. Margaret Johnson sat with her back straight in the waiting chair, the envelope resting carefully in both hands as if it carried something fragile. Her eyes followed the sunlight spreading across the tiled floor near the entrance, but her thoughts were miles away, already drifting toward the hospital across town. She imagined Daniel lying in the narrow hospital bed with the cartoon blanket he insisted on bringing from home, even though he said he was too old for it. The memory made her lips soften into a faint smile that lasted only a second before fading again. She glanced at the large wall clock above the teller windows. The second hand moved steadily forward. Each quiet tick reminded her that the morning was slipping away faster than she had planned. Across the lobby, Richard Collins continued helping the next customer with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed the earlier interruption had already been resolved. Papers moved across the counter. The computer monitor glowed softly in front of him. He spoke in a low professional tone while tapping information into the keyboard, barely glancing up from the screen. The young man in the gray sweater nodded politely and waited as the printer behind the counter began to hum. A few steps behind him, the tall man in the dark jacket had now reached the front of the line. Up close, he appeared even larger than Margaret had first realized, broad shoulders filling the space beneath the leather jacket. He stood with an easy calm that made it seem like he had all the time in the world. When Collins finished with the previous customer, he looked up and forced a polite customer service smile. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" The man removed his hands from his pockets slowly and stepped closer to the counter. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and steady. "Before we do that, I have a question." Collins blinked once, clearly not expecting that response. "All right," he said carefully. What can I help you with? The man tilted his head slightly toward the row of waiting chairs across the lobby. His gaze rested for a brief moment on Margaret Johnson sitting quietly with the envelope in her lap. The woman who was just here, he said. Why did you turn her away? Collins followed his line of sight and immediately stiffened. His polite expression tightened again into the same guarded professionalism Margaret had seen earlier. Sir, that situation has already been handled, he replied. It was simply a matter of incomplete documentation. The man nodded slowly, as though considering the explanation. He rested one hand lightly on the counter. Incomplete documentation, he repeated. His eyes moved briefly across the bank lobby, taking in the waiting customers, the tellers behind their stations, and the silent security guard near the entrance who pretended to watch the doors. Then the man looked back at Collins with the same calm expression. That is interesting, he said, because from where I was standing, it looked like she had everything you asked for. Collins shifted his weight behind the counter. Sir, I assure you our policies are very clear. Without proper verification, we cannot process a withdrawal of that size. The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. You knew the amount? Collins hesitated for half a second before realizing what he had revealed. The man's gaze sharpened just enough to make the pause noticeable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Across the room, Margaret adjusted the envelope in her hands and glanced toward the counter again. Unaware that the quiet conversation unfolding there was slowly pulling the attention of the entire bank back toward the moment everyone thought had already ended. The brief silence at the counter stretched just long enough for a few nearby customers to notice that something unusual was unfolding again. Richard Collins cleared his throat and straightened the stack of documents beside the keyboard as though restoring order to the moment. Sir, he said carefully, our policies require that certain transactions be verified through additional documentation, especially when the amount involved is significant. The tall man listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, almost patient, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was weighing every word. And she did not provide that documentation? He asked quietly. Collins shook his head once. Not to the level required for a withdrawal of that size. The man leaned slightly closer to the counter, resting both hands on the polished surface. His voice stayed low, but it carried easily across the quiet space. What size are we talking about? Collins hesitated again. The pause was small, but it was enough for the man to notice. Sir, Collins said, choosing his words more carefully now, customer account information is private. The man nodded slowly. Of course it is. He glanced briefly across the lobby again, his eyes landing once more on Margaret Johnson sitting near the window. She had opened the envelope again and was reviewing the papers inside as though searching for something she might have missed earlier. The sunlight from the street touched the silver strands in her hair, making them glow softly against the darker fabric of her coat. The man looked back at the manager. But you just said the withdrawal was large. Collins felt the conversation slipping out of the routine pattern he preferred. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Sir, if you are not here to conduct your own transaction, I would ask that we allow the line to move forward. A few customers farther back in line exchanged curious glances. The man did not step away. Instead, he slid a small bank slip toward the counter. Actually, he said calmly, I am here to conduct a transaction. Collins glanced at the slip, then back up again. All right, he said. How may we assist you today? The man lifted his head slightly, and for the first time the brim of his cap shifted enough for the light to reach more of his face. His expression remained composed, but his eyes held a quiet intensity that made Collins pause again. I would like to withdraw some money as well, the man said. In fact, I would like to withdraw the same amount that woman requested. Collins frowned. Sir, without knowing the amount you cannot possibly, the man interrupted gently. You already told me it was significant. Collins stared at him for a moment, unsure how to proceed. Behind the counter, one of the tellers slowed her typing, listening without looking up. Near the entrance, the security guard shifted his stance slightly, but remained where he was. The man continued in the same calm tone. Let us assume the amount is large enough to require documentation. He gestured toward the envelope Margaret held. She appeared to have brought quite a few papers with her. Collins crossed his arms lightly, trying to regain control of the exchange. Sir, if you wish to make a withdrawal, I will need your identification. The man reached into his jacket pocket and removed a wallet. He placed a card on the counter. Collins picked it up automatically, his eyes scanning the name before he fully realized what he was reading. For a moment, the confident rhythm of the bank manager's morning broke completely. His gaze lifted slowly from the card to the man standing in front of him. Across the lobby, Margaret Johnson looked up again, just as the quiet tension in the room returned, stronger now than before, as though something important had just begun to unfold. Richard Collins stared at the identification card resting in his hand, as though the letters printed on it had suddenly become difficult to read. For several seconds he said nothing. The quiet in the bank lobby thickened again, spreading slowly from the counter toward the waiting line and the chairs along the wall. Collins blinked once, then again, as if confirming that he had not misunderstood what was written there. The name on the card was unmistakable. His eyes lifted slowly toward the man standing in front of him. The baseball cap still shaded part of his face, but the features were now clear enough that recognition settled into the manager's expression with visible discomfort. "Mr. Diesel," Collins said carefully, his voice losing the confident edge it carried earlier that morning. The tall man gave a small nod, calm and unhurried. "That is correct." Collins quickly straightened his posture and glanced briefly toward the other tellers behind the counter, as if hoping the moment had gone unnoticed. But the room had already begun to shift again. The young teller at the next station stopped typing entirely. Two customers farther back in line leaned slightly forward, their curiosity now openly visible. Even the security guard near the entrance seemed more attentive than before. Vin Diesel rested one hand casually on the counter, his attention steady on the manager. "You were saying something about verification," he said in the same, even tone. Collins forced a polite smile that appeared far more strained than earlier. "Of course, sir. If you are planning to withdraw funds today, we can certainly assist you." Vin Diesel nodded slightly toward the waiting chairs. "I would like to withdraw the same amount that woman requested." Collins hesitated again. The manager's training told him to redirect the conversation, but the calm persistence in the man's voice made that difficult. "Sir," Collins said slowly, "as I explained earlier, that transaction required documentation that she was unable to provide." Vin Diesel tilted his head slightly. "That is not what I saw." Collins adjusted the card in his hand, suddenly aware that several people in the lobby were watching him. "Mr. Diesel, with respect, you may not have been aware of all the details involved." Vin Diesel glanced toward Margaret Johnson again. She remained seated near the window, unaware that the focus of the entire bank had begun shifting quietly in her direction. She was studying one of the papers inside her envelope, her brow slightly furrowed as though she was still trying to determine what the bank needed from her. Vin Diesel looked back at the manager. "She brought identification," he said. "She brought account statements. And she brought a letter from this bank confirming the account number." Collins cleared his throat. "Even so, certain withdrawals require additional review." Vin Diesel's voice remained calm, but the words landed with quiet weight. "How much did she ask for?" Collins froze for a fraction of a second before answering. $15,000. Vin Diesel nodded slowly. "That is not unusual for someone who has held an account here for 3 decades. Collins opened his mouth to respond, but Vin Diesel continued before he could speak. "Especially someone paying medical bills." The manager's expression tightened again. "Sir, we cannot discuss another customer's situation." Vin Diesel met his eyes steadily. "You already did." The words were not loud, but they carried across the counter with unmistakable clarity. Behind them, the bank lobby had grown quiet once more. Customers pretended to check their phones, but their attention remained fixed on the exchange unfolding at the counter. Vin Diesel leaned slightly closer, his voice lowering just enough to feel personal. "You told me the withdrawal was significant. You told me she lacked verification, and you asked her to leave." Collins swallowed, the confident control he had displayed earlier fading under the calm pressure of the conversation. Vin Diesel gestured gently toward the waiting chairs again. "She is still here," he said, "which means the situation is not finished yet." The manager glanced toward Margaret Johnson once more. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared clearly in his eyes as the quiet tension inside the bank continued to grow. Richard Collins felt the weight of the room pressing quietly against the counter as the tall man's words settled into the air. For the first time since the morning had begun, the manager did not immediately reach for his keyboard or a stack of forms. Instead, he glanced again toward the row of chairs along the window. Margaret Johnson sat exactly where she had been a moment earlier, her shoulders slightly hunched as she carefully reread one of the documents from the envelope in her lap. The soft light from the street framed her silhouette against the glass, and for a moment the entire scene seemed strangely still, as though time itself had slowed inside the bank lobby. Collins cleared his throat again, attempting to recover the smooth professionalism that had guided his day up until now. "Mr. Diesel," he said cautiously, "I understand your concern, but bank policies exist for a reason." Vin Diesel did not raise his voice. He did not lean closer or show frustration. He simply stood there, calm and steady, his eyes moving briefly toward Margaret before returning to the manager. "Policies should protect people," he said quietly, "not push them away." Collins shifted his weight slightly behind the counter, aware that the conversation had now drawn the attention of nearly everyone inside the building. The printer behind him had stopped humming. One of the tellers had paused with a check halfway through the scanner. Even the quiet murmur of conversations had faded again. "Sir," Collins replied, choosing his words carefully, "we must verify transactions above certain amounts. It is standard procedure." Vin Diesel nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. "That makes sense." Collins seemed relieved for a moment, as though the agreement might bring the conversation to a close. But the tall man continued speaking in the same measured tone. "But you did not verify anything." The sentence landed softly, yet its meaning cut straight through the tension lingering in the room. Collins frowned slightly. "I reviewed the documents she presented." Vin Diesel shook his head once. "You looked at them," he said. "That is not the same thing." Across the lobby, Margaret adjusted the envelope again, her fingers moving carefully along the edges of the papers. She still had not noticed the attention gathering around her situation. Her focus remained fixed on the documents and the quiet urgency of the morning she had hoped would move faster. Vin Diesel watched her for a moment before speaking again. "She said the money was for her grandson's surgery," he said. Collins' expression tightened again, the manager clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Sir, we cannot discuss personal matters involving other customers." Vin Diesel's voice remained calm. "You already did that too." Another quiet pause spread across the room. Collins inhaled slowly and placed the identification card back on the counter. "Mr. Diesel," he said carefully, "if you would like to conduct your transaction today, we will be happy to assist you immediately." Vin Diesel did not reach for the card. Instead, he folded his arms lightly across his chest and glanced once more toward Margaret Johnson. "I will conduct my transaction," he said after a moment. Collins nodded quickly, ready to proceed. "Very good, sir. What amount would you like to withdraw today?" Vin Diesel looked back at the manager with the same steady gaze that had not changed since the conversation began. "The same $15,000 she requested," he said. Collins blinked again, clearly unsure why the request mattered. "That can be arranged," he replied. Vin Diesel gave a small nod, then gestured gently toward the chairs near the window. "But before you process anything," he said quietly, "I would like you to review her account again." Collins hesitated. "Sir, that is not necessary." Vin Diesel did not move. His voice remained calm, but the words carried a quiet certainty that filled the lobby once more. "It is necessary." The manager glanced toward Margaret Johnson again, then back at the computer screen glowing in front of him. For a long second he said nothing. Then, slowly, his fingers moved toward the keyboard as the silent tension inside the bank grew even stronger. Richard Collins stared at the glowing monitor in front of him as his fingers hovered above the keyboard. For several seconds he did not type anything. The quiet expectation from the man standing across the counter made the moment feel heavier than a routine transaction ever should have been. Collins glanced briefly toward Vin Diesel again, hoping perhaps the request would fade if he simply waited long enough. But the tall man did not move. His posture remained calm and patient, as if he understood that the truth sometimes required a little extra time to appear. Finally, Collins lowered his hands onto the keyboard and entered the account number he had seen earlier that morning. The screen refreshed with a soft flicker of light. Numbers and account details filled the display. Collins leaned slightly closer to read the information more carefully than he had before. At first his expression showed the same confidence he carried earlier. But as his eyes scanned the lines of information, one detail stopped him. His brow tightened. He scrolled down slowly. The cursor moved across the screen again. Another number appeared. Then another. The color drained from his face so gradually that no one in the lobby noticed at first except the man standing in front of him. Vin Diesel watched quietly without saying a word. Collins cleared his throat again, this time more nervously. He adjusted the position of the monitor as if a different angle might somehow change what he was seeing. The teller at the neighboring station noticed his reaction and glanced toward the screen before quickly looking away. The manager leaned closer to the keyboard again and opened another page within the account profile. Transaction history, deposits, long-term balances. The account had been active for more than 3 decades, exactly as Margaret Johnson had said. Month after month the balance had grown steadily. Small deposits from years earlier followed by larger ones later on. Careful saving, consistent discipline. The kind of financial record most banks proudly displayed when discussing loyal customers. Collins swallowed slowly. The current balance appeared again in the corner of the screen, impossible to ignore. The number was far larger than $15,000. Far larger than he had assumed when he dismissed her request only minutes earlier. Across the lobby, Margaret Johnson still sat quietly near the window, unaware that the manager who had turned her away was now staring at the full truth of her account history. Vin Diesel finally spoke, his voice calm and low. "What does it say?" Collins hesitated. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor. The silence stretched long enough that several customers shifted uncomfortably in line. Finally, the manager answered. "The account is valid." Vin Diesel nodded slightly. "And the balance?" Collins took another breath before replying. "It is well above the requested withdrawal." The tall man remained composed, though his gaze sharpened just enough to hold the manager's attention. So the problem was not the account. Collins shook his head slowly. "No, the problem was not the documentation either," Vin Diesel continued gently. Collins looked down at the papers still resting near the keyboard, the same documents Margaret Johnson had tried to show him earlier. He realized then that he had barely read them at all. "No," he admitted quietly. The room seemed even quieter now than before. Vin Diesel glanced once more toward the woman sitting by the window. "Then perhaps," he said calmly, "you should invite her back to the counter." Collins followed his gaze across the lobby. Margaret Johnson was folding the papers back into her envelope, preparing to leave as though she had already accepted the morning's disappointment. For a moment the manager simply stood there, understanding the mistake he had made as clearly as the numbers still glowing on the screen. Then slowly he stepped away from the keyboard and looked toward the waiting chairs, realizing the moment he thought had ended earlier was only now reaching its most important point. Richard Collins stood behind the counter for several seconds without moving, the glow of the computer screen still reflecting faintly in his eyes. The numbers on the account page had not changed, yet they had changed everything about the situation unfolding in the bank lobby. Slowly he straightened his tie and looked across the room toward the waiting chairs. Margaret Johnson had just finished placing the last sheet of paper back into her envelope. She pressed the flap closed carefully, the way someone does when they are preparing to walk away from a place that clearly does not want them to stay. Collins inhaled slowly and stepped out from behind the counter. The sudden movement caught the attention of several customers who had been quietly watching the scene develop. The manager walked across the polished floor toward the chairs near the window, his shoes making soft echoes against the tile. Margaret noticed him approaching and immediately began to rise from her seat, assuming she was about to be asked once again to leave the building. Her posture remained polite and calm, though there was a hint of quiet disappointment in her eyes. "Ma'am," Collins said, stopping a few feet in front of her. For the first time that morning his voice carried none of the impatience from earlier. "Mrs. Johnson, I owe you an apology." Margaret looked slightly confused, her hand still resting on the envelope she held against her purse. "I am sorry," she said gently. Collins nodded once, choosing his words carefully. "I should have reviewed your account more carefully before asking you to step aside." Margaret blinked, unsure how to respond. She had spent a lifetime learning that apologies in places like this were rare. "Your account is fully verified," Collins continued, "and your withdrawal request can absolutely be processed today." Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly as the meaning of his words settled in. For a moment she simply looked at him, as though confirming that the tone had truly changed. Across the lobby, Vin Diesel remained standing quietly at the counter, watching the exchange with the same calm patience he had carried from the beginning. Collins gestured politely toward the teller stations. If you would be willing to come back to the counter, we can assist you right away. Margaret nodded slowly and rose from the chair. She held the envelope carefully as she walked beside the manager toward the counter again. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Customers who had pretended not to watch earlier were now openly following the moment with curious eyes. When Margaret reached the counter again, Collins pulled a chair slightly closer to the windowed desk so she could sit comfortably while the transaction was completed. The gesture was small, but the difference in tone was unmistakable. Margaret sat down and slid the envelope gently across the counter once more. "I only need $15,000, she said softly. Collins nodded respectfully. "That will be ready in just a moment." He signaled one of the tellers to begin processing the request while he personally reviewed the documents that he had previously dismissed. This time he read every line carefully. Across the counter, Vin Diesel finally stepped forward slightly, giving Margaret a small nod of encouragement. She recognized him now, and her eyes widened with quiet surprise. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. Vin Diesel simply nodded back, his expression calm and respectful as the bank lobby slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Though everyone present knew they had just witnessed something far more meaningful than a simple financial transaction. The quiet rhythm of the bank slowly returned as the teller finished counting the money behind the counter. The soft sound of paper bills being organized and placed into a neat envelope blended with the faint hum of printers and keyboards returning to life. Margaret Johnson sat calmly in the chair near the counter, her hands folded gently in her lap as she waited. Her shoulders seemed lighter now, as though the tension that had followed her into the building earlier that morning had finally begun to fade. Richard Collins returned to the counter, holding the sealed bank envelope with careful attention. His posture was noticeably different from the way he had stood earlier. He placed the envelope respectfully on the counter in front of Margaret. "Mrs. Johnson," he said with sincere professionalism, "your withdrawal of $15,000 has been completed. If there is anything else our branch can assist you with today, please let us know." Margaret looked at the envelope for a moment before lifting it carefully with both hands. She nodded politely. "Thank you," she said softly. There was no anger in her voice, only quiet dignity. She placed the envelope into her purse and closed it gently before standing up from the chair. When she turned, her eyes met the tall man who had remained nearby the entire time. The baseball cap was still low on his head, but there was no mistaking him now. Margaret smiled warmly. "You did not have to do that for me," she said. Vin Diesel shook his head slightly, his voice calm and respectful. "Sometimes people just need someone to slow things down for a moment," he replied. Margaret nodded thoughtfully as though she understood exactly what he meant. For a second, neither of them spoke. The sunlight through the bank windows reflected softly across the polished floor, filling the room with a quiet warmth that had been missing earlier in the morning. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse over her shoulder. "My grandson is waiting for surgery," she said gently. "This will help take care of his hospital bill." Vin Diesel gave her a small, encouraging nod. "He is lucky to have you," he said. Margaret smiled again, the kind of smile that came from years of patience and strength. She turned toward the glass doors of the bank and began walking slowly across the lobby. As she passed the waiting customers, several people stepped slightly aside to give her space, their expressions softer than before. The heavy glass door opened, and the late morning sunlight spilled across the entrance. Margaret stepped outside onto the sidewalk, pausing briefly to look up at the clear sky before continuing down the street toward the parking lot. Inside the bank, the tension that had once filled the room had completely disappeared. Richard Collins stood quietly behind the counter watching the door close, the lesson of the morning still fresh in his mind. Vin Diesel picked up his identification card from the counter and slipped it back into his wallet. Without saying anything else, he turned and walked calmly toward the exit as well. The lobby returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the moment that had unfolded inside those walls lingered quietly in the thoughts of everyone who had witnessed it. A simple reminder that respect should never depend on assumptions.